Well, good afternoon. Uh, this is Aesthetics with Professor Gunter, and I'm talking to you about the third lecture or third essay we've read in feminism, and that's the MoMA's Hot Mamas. Okay, the MoMA is the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I've been there many, many times, and it has had an immense influence on American art and American thinking and on world thinking and world art. It encapsulates what Tom Wolfe spoke of in The Painted Word, and that is the flight from all representation or all picturing or even referring to the natural world, including, I would say, would have to be the human body. And it would include then women, I think, and children and animals and trees and everything else. You had to flee from that in order to get to something that was abstract. And finally, as you sought for, and I think Wolfe portrays this rather well, that you go from more abstract to more abstract to more abstract till you get nothing. Now you might say, well, these people were secret Buddhists. And if you knew a bit about Buddhism, of which there are different kinds, the one that's best known in America is Zen Buddhism. Probably because Japan is the nearest of the Oriental nations, and they brought a lot of Zen Buddhism with them. And it caught on in California, where, as we know, anything strange can catch on in California. We know that, don't we? So you seek to turn your back on all particularity and all nature, and you get this nothingness. But with the Buddhists, and not just the Zen Buddhists, you then go back to nature. You're back in the world, and you're living. I don't see these artists doing that. They simply exit, and they say, follow us to the great nothing, and then there you are. And this strikes me as so very strange. And so what Carol Duncan does here in the MoMA's Hot Mamas is examine this from a woman's point of view, and then you suddenly realize that these people weren't trying to build some new science, the American artists, but what were they doing? They were trying to free themselves from something. What was it? After purifying the work of a residue of surrealist representation, they made the final breakthrough into the realm of absolute spirit. Now, this is on page 115. Let me read that again. After purifying their work of a residue of surrealist representation, because the surrealists did represent the world, and so did the Cubists, but they represented it in a different way. So the Americans had to go beyond that. Why? Well, you had to go beyond it so that you could absolutely get away from any representation of the world. Why do you have to do that? Well, because we have to get away and explore new things. You're trying to keep us from exploring new things. No, I want to know why it's necessary that you have to do this. And the answer is not given, but Duncan does a good job of analyzing it. The final breakthrough into the realm of absolute spirit, manifested as absolute formal, non-representational purity. It is in reference to their achievement that, according to the Museum of Modern Art, all later significant art continues to measure its ambitions and scale by this stripping away of the real world and the movement into an emptiness. And so she casts an interesting light on why this was such an obsession. But she takes it as being a male obsession, a flight from the primal mother, from Gaia, from the earth mother. Mater is mother, but it also is matter, and it also is matrix. In mathematics, a matrix is something that generates numbers. In nature, a matrix is something that generates children in whatever species. So you have to free yourself from mother, you have to free yourself from mater, you have to free yourself from the matrix. And so she takes this as a male compulsion. And she does a very good job of showing you that that was a significant part of it. Okay? So the museum, to continue, it had a strictly, and this is on page 115 still, a strictly linear and highly formalist art history narrative. Okay? And that's what Tom Wolfe observed when he got this revelation. You can't paint it anymore, you have to describe it, you have to theorize it. So, and they have embraced this tenaciously. So, when you go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and I hope you will, I hope you keep this in mind. That isn't just a museum, it is almost a church, a sort of modernist cathedral in which you are taught what is the fundamental way to cleanse yourself of all this terrible stuff. And it is the way to gain enlightenment. Like Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, who had his enlightenment under the bow tree. You have your enlightenment, not in China under a tree, but in New York in a new colossal building, very modern. But you're being taught, if not a religion, then at least a kind of mythology and a cleansing ritual almost. Come and be cleansed. That's what Robert Frost said once. These are your waters and your watering place. Drink and be whole again beyond confusion. Hot damn. And so, like any one of these mythologies, they claim to save you from something and to clarify something, and then you'll be enlightened. But this is a whole lot to argue about art, for God's sake. Does art have to be the savior of mankind? And here again, this is a sort of quasi-Nietzschean, in the sense that art is that which purifies and makes you whole or real. I don't know that you have to assume that before you like art. Do you have to? Well, it's been an assumption going around. Okay. For much of the academic world, as for the larger art public, the kind of art history that the MoMA narrates still constitutes the definitive history of modern art. And that's what I keep saying. This modernist and formalist account of art is now really dead. There is no avant-garde. You can't go any further, or I don't see how you could, and the artists don't see how you could. And yet we have to keep up this modernist rant about how we are breaking through to new realms and how we are creating reality and saving mankind. My God, fella, just paint. But that's not how these cultural narratives work. Okay, so then one of the things that Carol Duncan does that has helped shed some light on the process of art in America starting at the end of the Second World War. Okay. Now I'm on page 116. As the literature of modern art portrays it, their progressive renunciation of representation, repeatedly and minutely documented in monographs and catalogs and so forth, is often achieved through painful or self-sacrificing searching or courageous risk-taking. Well, and they, you know, in Picasso and Matisse and any number of other early French artists who broke with the 19th century and earlier centuries did have to take chances, and I'm sure a lot of it was painful. Uh, I don't know how much I don't know how much I value pain for its own sake. Uh, the Russians say they have made a science of suffering, but I don't know how far you have to go with that in order to produce something of value. Sometimes value in art just comes. So that's the first thing. And then she mentions at the beginning that there's a counterpoint in all this that Woolf doesn't mention at all. And that's along with these abstract designs, you get a series of pictures of women. And in Picasso, you get both. And in de Kooning, you get both. And in a number of the American modernists, you get both. That is, the artists both painted these abstractions, but they painted women. But the women that you get in these paintings, how can I put this? Thank God I never met one on a blind date. These are not the women I see around me on campus or at Kroger's or at the movie show. These are not the women that I see on television. And they're not the women that I grew up around. They are these incredibly lewd and dangerous women. And if this is the essence of women, I think the men should just as well go die somewhere. And I'll get to that in a minute. So then, having said this, that there's a counterpoint going on. With this abstraction, you have a sort of drumbeat of negative pictures of women as dangerous or lewd, prostitutes or monsters. And so this does portray a kind of male fantasy. So what do museums do? Well, they're like churches. You don't usually think of it this way. But museums are like churches in that they portray a basic truth, they portray a basic narrative, they portray a route to salvation, and they do this by the architecture. I've always been fascinated with Gothic cathedrals as they point upward towards the sky. In France, in the country, and I've been there and taken motorcycle tours, and you can't get out of sight of the spire of a Gothic cathedral. If you go this way, the other one in the back will sort of disappear, but then the one in the future in the front of you will come up. And then when you get past it, the next one will come up. In the French countryside, you cannot get out of the sight of the cathedral, and it's teaching you a lesson 24 hours a day. And so with art museums, they're not, in a way, I don't like to put it this way, but they're not innocent. And when you go to the Museum of Modern Art in Fort Worth, you're getting a different catechism than if you go to the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, which is a museum that covers everything, but then has to concentrate on older art. Or if you go to the Amon Carter Museum, then it's entirely different from the other two, not consistent with it. It's the Museum of Western Art. And it's cowboys, and it's Indians, and it's prairies, and it's... I find it fascinating. But look at the difference between that. I mean, it's teaching you a way of life. And which, if you were raised in Texas by Texans, you were raised with that kind of myth in view. And then you can take that myth in different ways. I took it that I was supposed to be courageous under all circumstances, which is scary as hell, since it's very hard to be courageous under all circumstances, and sometimes it may be better just to run in any case. But these art museums aren't just museums, they state a viewpoint. So when you go to a museum, know that you're not just seeing paintings, which is fine, or sculpture or whatever. Nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong with the diversity of it. But remember that you're quietly being lectured about the way, the truth, and the life. And very few people go to a museum recognizing that. So, a museum, as she says, is a prestigious and powerful engine of ideology. Like all those great museums, the MoMA's, this is on 117, the MoMA's ritual transmit a complex ideological signal. But what signal? The collection's recurrent image of sexualized female bodies actively masculinizes the museum as a social environment. That is, the point is the abstraction. The counterpoint is the woman. Why does she say this? Because she finds it in modern art museums and in the product of modern artists, or modernist artists, everywhere. She didn't find it everywhere, she couldn't write this article. Okay? So, let me get my glasses so that I can read this with some clarity. So what's the central moral of modern art? A, and this is the top of page 118, the quest for spiritual transcendence, and I think it would be great if you got that in your notes. And second, a sexualized female body on the other. Now, let me say two things about that. First of all, I think this takes what Thomas Wolfe describes and agrees with Wolfe's description, but casts a vivid light on it where Wolfe just stops and says, well, here's what they did, and wasn't this crazy? And we've had too much theory in art. But he doesn't see any of the things that Carol Duncan sees. And she shows you that there was almost a Freudian kind of impetus in this to escape from matter, from mother, from nature, from the world, and thereby purify yourself, but from what? So let me repeat it. The quest for spiritual transcendence, but this is hooked up with a counter quest for the female body. Now, let me suggest, this is a terrible thing to say, and I know that most men will be upset, but women are not just bodies. They're people. Huh? They're people. And so this obsession with the human body, male body, let me start over. This obsession with the female body then ends up in an obsession with fear of the woman and an obsession with sex. There's something interesting about Sigmund Freud, and that is, as I've said before, his psychoanalysis is a thoroughly masculine thing. And as he said, what do women want? I don't understand. No, Sigmund, you didn't understand because your theory wouldn't let you understand very well. But in a way, this is almost a Freudian take on modernist art and abstract art. That the other side of this was woman and nature And so somehow you have to transcend this, and then if that's the case, there are going to be all kinds of problems in the way that men in the society, the way that men relate to women, and the failure to understand women. And there's going to also be a hell of a lot of environmental problems as you take nature as simply that other thing that has to be put down. That's called the war against nature. We've won it, and now nature is going to take its revenge. So, two things: the quest for spiritual transcendence and an obsession with a sexualized human female body. Why did that happen? And it did happen because the evidence is in the art museums and in the product of these abstract artists. Many of the works I just mentioned feature distorted or dangerous-looking creatures, potentially overpowering, devouring, or castrating. Indeed, the MoMA's collection of monstrous, threatening females is exceptional. And so what Duncan gives us is two different paintings. Let me get the Picasso's Demoiselle and Seated Bather, and the latter is a giant praying mantis. It's a woman that turns out, if you look carefully, to be a praying mantis. So women are this evil, dark thing that wants to destroy and eat you. How deep is that? It needed a shrink, but if he went to Freud, Freud would only agree. So this masculine structuring of things, which I think only succeeds in making the human race unhappy, is at once a revolt against nature and a revolt against women, and then both have to be miscast in terms that aren't real. So, let's see. Well, let me. I will then show you the Demoiselle d'Avignon is in there, and interesting. Women revealing their genitals. Gee, Picasso, you sure are a genius to have figured out that. Why, no one ever examined that before. It's just almost childish. And then second, what happens when you reach the end of this divesting yourself of woman and nature and anything that is that concrete and actual? Where do you end up? And she has some interesting insights. Okay, this is on page 119 down in the third paragraph. The museum has always hung these works, the one of women, with precise attention to their strategic roles in the story of modern art. Before and after the 1984 expansion, de Kooning's Woman 1 hung at the threshold onto the spaces containing the big abstract expressionist breakthroughs. Why? Because it was an essential part of what was going on, but nothing was ever said about it. And this is not abstract. This bizarre picture of I guess, a woman or a woman's body, which is supposed to scare the hell out of me. What is it? But it was there at every point, and it was stressed. Okay? So then there's something else I want you to get in your notes in the middle of 119. The New York School's final collective leap into absolute, pure, abstract, non-referential transcendence. Let me repeat that, because it's got all of it in one set of words. Absolutely pure, absolutely abstract, absolutely non-referential uh, transcendence, then what do you have? You have a kind of emptiness. Now, Buddhists, as I've said now several times, and Buddhists embrace this, but that's not the emptiness that they embrace. It's something different. The Buddhist nothing isn't a zero. It's just not a thing. Thing different from basic insight. But for these abstract expressionists and pure abstract artists, finally you get to where the thing, even the geometrical shapes are too representational, so you have to get rid of them, and then you have pure ideas, but what kind of ideas? Essences, I suppose, and you're back with medieval theology, but you don't know it. You're talking about a realm of essences which is self-contained. And then how do you express those? And you end up with conceptual art, in which you can only conceptualize, but you mustn't do the work of art, or you don't need to. And so you end up with, I don't know, a kind of bad kind of philosophy taking the place of art, in which you are dealing with abstraction per se. If that's the case, then I think what you have is an art that is referenceless. It doesn't refer to anything. And then what have you got? I think that becomes the death of art, unless you have a very strange kind of pseudo-Buddhist philosophy. But then what you want is art, not a philosophy. So this has another paradox, and you see it in Nietzsche and in Nazism and in Wagnerian opera and elsewhere, that since men must transcend women and they must go to a realm of absolute spirit, there's no one in that realm but men. Is this homosexual? It's just the world of men among men, as Tennessee Williams once put it in one of his plays. So you have the paradox that men, in inserting themselves above the inferior women, can only live in a society of men. And that is, in some respect, homosexual. So you've got all these paradoxes playing themselves out in 20th century art, until they really do play themselves out, and it's not clear at all to us that art has any place else to go. So what is woman? And so I suggest that you look very closely at page 120. You'll notice that Tom Wolfe has Jackson Pollock doing the she-wolf as one of his paintings, one of his first breakthroughs. Why a she-wolf? What's the matter, Jackson? Not for nothing they called him Jack the Dripper. What was the she-wolf? And so if you go to page 120, you get woman number 1, and this is, it's not a woman, it's not even a woman's body. I don't know if you can see this from there. It's not even a woman's body. It's not too clear. If it weren't for the breasts, it would not be clear that this is a woman. So what is it? And I think rightly, she refers back to something you find in Greek sculpture, which Plato neglects to criticize, and this is the Gorgon, this dangerous, very dangerous woman that you don't want to get mixed up with. And you find that in Greek temples, and you find it in Greek architecture. What were they saying, and who was saying it? Duncan suggests that this is really infantile feelings of powerlessness before the mother. And that's since they would go back to early childhood, and the male would feel uh, fear before the mother, although most children that I know don't seem to display a fear of the mother. They cry and they want the mother. And of course, the girls are the same way. I mean, they have the same relation to the mother that the boys do. That, I think, as the boys and the girls continue to age and differentiate themselves sexually, that changes. But when a mother has an infant, infant be male or female, the relationship is much the same. Do women feel this fear of the mother? I don't see that, and why not? They should. But I don't get that. Maybe I haven't looked closely enough into the archives of despair written into the human soul. I'm sort of burlesquing the high seriousness of all these guys. Can't you just, relax for a change? No, I have to suffer so I can be a great artist. I have to suffer so I can be a Russian. Well, there's enough suffering in life. You don't have to go out and look for any extra. Just hang around. There'll be plenty. But pay some attention to de Kooning, the woman one, and try to see what you can make up of that. Oversized breasts, oversized eyes, and sharp sort of cutting teeth. And is this a smile? Oh, God. Like I said, I've had some unusual blind dates, but nothing comes. I think you would meet this at the door, and then you really would run quick. Oh. So I read on page 121 here at the bottom of the page. The head of de Kooning's woman one is so like that of the archaic Gorgon, Medusa, or gargoyle, that the reference could well be intentional, especially since the artist and his friends placed great store in ancient myths and primitive images and likened themselves to archaic and tribal shamans, which is a witch doctor, as we also call it. Thomas Hess echoed his claim in the passage comparing de Kooning's artistic ordeal, poor baby, to that of Perseus, the slayer of the Gorgon. Hess is arguing that de Kooning's woman one, or there are two of these, woman one and woman two, both equally depressing and frightening, grasp an elusive, dangerous truth by the throat. And what is this dangerous truth that you have to get by the throat? And truth can be touched only by complications, ambiguities, and paradox, so like the hero who looked for Medusa in the mirroring shield, he must study her flat, reflected image every inch of the way. You sure about that? Okay. So what picture then do you get of the woman and of the male? So on page 122, I read again, on the second paragraph, down about 10 lines. The woman is not only a monument and iconic. In high-heeled shoes and brassiere, she is also lewd, her pose indecently teasing. De Kooning acknowledged her oscillating character, claiming her for a likeness not only to serious art, ancient icons and high art nudes, but also to pin-ups and girly pictures of the vulgar present. He saw her as simultaneously frightening and ludicrous. Well, young ladies in this audience, surely you find this ludicrous and stupid. Or do you? I suspect I do, and I suspect that most people do. When you get your attention drawn to it, then what have you got? And you've got not just a I suppose, a cruel caricature of woman. But you don't have any insight into femininity whatsoever. Goethe, the great German poet, once remarked, "The eternal feminine doth lure us on." Well, good for Goethe, who had a sense of wholeness. He was sane compared to these guys. There's another good reason to get beyond modernist art as it lived and killed itself in pure abstraction. And I think if I were speaking to the art department, probably half of the faculty would get up and leave, or they would just say, well, there's just another philosopher. But diagnosing an illness, whether it's the coronavirus or something else, is a whole lot easier than curing it. Where can we turn now to bring us back to some function of art that gives us some, what Aristotle thought it could give, and what even Nietzsche thought it could give, and that's a kind of catharsis, or a kind of resolution of problems. Okay, and how it could be entertaining, because one of the things that's wrong with this modernist art, it's an art for the few. The peasants aren't going to like this, and we don't care. It's for the elite. Modernist art is elitist art. And one of its attractions is that if you could become a lover of modernist art, you become elite. You don't want to be redneck. You don't want to be the drunk in the bar. You don't want to be the guy in the assembly line. You want to be elite. Well, haven't we had too much elitism? And then the sense that art is not for people. Art is for the few, and much less it's for the few men. How long are we going to be able to sell art and art museums to people when most people are left out of it intentionally? Medieval art reached everyone. That's something as I've come to know more and more about Russia. One of the kinds of paintings that the Russians did and perfected and specialized was called the icon. And the icons were found in churches, but the peasants would struggle to get to see an icon for its religious truth and for its aesthetic truth. But that was peasants. That is, everyone understood the Gothic cathedral and shared in it not only the message that they could see any place in the landscape, but the church itself with its message. And the message transcended the evil and the negative. Where it's not clear that abstract art and modernist art do that. But not only did the whole city share in the cathedral, but many people in the cathedral shared in building it. Some people with the glass and the stained glass, some as stone workers, some as designing the pews, some as designing the rugs, all sorts of things. And you'll notice in the Gothic cathedral, what strikes me more and more, you are lifted up towards God and towards the good, which you must never forget. But all the way up, there are gorgons and weird figures of evil things. And so that church, in its physical existence, is telling you, yes, you can achieve this purity and salvation, but you'll find a lot of monsters on the way. What the modernists seem to be saying about women, and implicitly about nature, is that the only way to escape this is into nothingness, which is a kind of nihilism. Nihilism, if you cut the word up, nothing, which is nihil, ism, belief in nothing. So at the end of modernism, do you get nihilism or what? I don't think anybody dealt with that. They were so sure that they were pure and better that they didn't have to deal with the question of nihilism. So what you get, I'm still on page 122, at the end of the third paragraph. With it, de Kooning knowingly and assertively exercises his patriarchal privilege of objectifying male sexual fantasy as high culture. I mean, the medievals knew better than that. Oh, hell, Dr. Gunnar is telling you you'd be better off as a Christian. You'd be a lot less, potentially a lot less neurotic. Objectifying male sexual fantasy as high culture. No, it isn't. It's just, the old saying of the Texasche Volkskultur, a horny toad is its own reward. Surely you've heard that somewhere. Well, I made it up, so it's not very good. I mean, why does horniness have to become an absolute and transcendent value? Is that sick? Is that silly? Oh, please. So, and the same thing you find then in Picasso. And so I move over on to page 123, and I quote again. Thus Picasso uses art history to argue his thesis that the awesome goddess, the terrible witch, and the lewd whore are but facets of a single many-sided creature, in turn threatening and seductive, imposing and self-abasing, dominating and powerless, and always the psychic property of a male imagination. This is no longer a woman as a woman, it's a woman as a male sees the woman, which is the damn problem when we deal with each other as being of different sexes. If I see you as this male fantasy, then I don't see you. It would make it impossible for a man to have the slightest understanding of a woman as a human being. Thanks a lot. Gee, if I hadn't had this, I could be happy. We don't want that. We want to transcend mere people who are happy. They're just nothing. Let's seek for unhappiness. So, to go on, and always the psychic property of a male imagination. Picasso also implies the truly great, powerful, and revelatory art has always been and must be built upon such exclusive male property. And again, Picasso has said that women are many-sided. There's a negative side, there's a positive side, there's an aggressive side, there's a loving side. It's also true of men. It's just true of women. Women could make the same mistake that the abstract artist did, but they don't have to. And I think there's somehow that they would be less likely to. It has always struck me that in some ways women were more wise than men. Well, sure, they're silly women, but a lot of women have considerable insight that men, if you were raised to be a jock, like I was, you couldn't be an athlete in Houston in the 1940s and 50s. You weren't much, unless you had a lot of money. That seemed to, or a soldier. You could be one of those three. Otherwise, you weren't really acceptable.